The rain hammered against the mahogany door like bullets, each drop carrying the weight of desperation. Maya's knuckles were raw from knocking, her soaked dress clinging to her trembling frame as she clutched a sleeping infant to her chest. Behind the store lived the man she'd only seen in business magazine as a cold, calculating, untouchable. But tonight, with nowhere else to turn and her baby's life hanging in the balance, even the most impenetrable fortress seemed worth approaching. When the door finally opened, revealing James Morrison in his silk pajamas and designer slippers, Maya almost fled. His steel-gray eyes swept over her bedraggled appearance, the torn dress, the bruises barely hidden by smudged makeup, the terror etched into every line of her face. This was the CEO who'd built an empire on ruthless decisions, who'd never shown mercy to failing competitors. Yet something flickered in his expression that Maya couldn't quite identify. Not pity, something deeper. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I just need somewhere safe for the night. My baby." Her words dissolved into a sob as thunder crashed overhead, and the infant stirred restlessly in her arms. James stood frozen in his doorway, his mind racing through 1,000 calculations. In his world, every decision had consequences, every kindness could be exploited, every weakness targeted. The logical choice was obvious: to call the police, let them handle it, protect himself from whatever chaos this woman might bring. But as he looked into her eyes, seeing the raw desperation of a mother protecting her child, something inside him cracked open like an eggshell. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside without hesitation. Maya stumbled into the marble foyer, water pooling at her feet as she tried to process what had just happened. The man who'd built Morrison Industries from nothing, who was known for his iron will and calculated moves, had just opened his home to a complete stranger. The warmth hit her like a physical force after hours in the freezing rain, and she swayed on her feet. James caught her elbow gently. "You're hypothermic," he observed, his voice taking on an unexpected tenderness. "We need to get you both warm immediately." Without waiting for a response, he guided her toward the living room, where a fire crackled in an enormous stone fireplace. "I don't understand," Maya managed between chattering teeth. "Why would you? I mean, you don't even know me." "No," James agreed, wrapping a cashmere throw around her shoulders. "But I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." The admission surprised him as much as it did her. He hadn't spoken about his childhood in decades, of the foster homes, the nights spent sleeping in doorways, the constant fear of being turned away. As Maya settled into the leather armchair closest to the fire, her baby finally opened his eyes. The infant couldn't be more than 6 months old, with the kind of innocent gaze that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. James found himself kneeling beside the chair, completely transfixed. "What's his name?" he asked softly. "David," Maya replied, her voice thick with exhaustion and something else: shame, perhaps, or regret. "He's all I have left." Over the next hour, as Maya warmed up and David slept peacefully in her arms, the story emerged in fragments. An abusive husband who'd finally gone too far, a desperate escape in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a bus ticket to this wealthy neighborhood because Maya had remembered reading that James Morrison lived here, and somehow, in her desperation, she'd convinced herself that a man who'd risen from nothing might understand what it meant to have everything stripped away. "I know it sounds crazy," she said, staring into the flames, "but I read about your foundation, the shelters you funded." I thought maybe she trailed off, unable to finish the thought that had driven her to the doorstep. James was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. His charitable foundation was public knowledge, but most people saw it as a tax write-off or a publicity stunt. Few understood that every dollar came from a place of genuine recognition. He'd been where these people were, and he'd never forgotten the feeling of being invisible to a world that had everything he needed to survive. "You're not crazy," he said finally. "You're a mother protecting her child. That's the sanest thing in the world." As the night wore on, something extraordinary began to unfold. James, who hadn't had a real conversation outside of boardrooms in years, found himself talking about things he'd buried decades ago. Maya, despite her fear and exhaustion, began to see past the intimidating exterior to the man underneath, as someone who understood loss, who remembered what it felt like to be powerless. "I have guest rooms upstairs," James said as dawn began to creep through the windows. "You and David are welcome to stay as long as you need." Maya shook her head immediately. "I can't accept that. You've already done more than a—" "Then let's call it an employment opportunity," James interrupted, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My housekeeper has been begging me to hire an assistant, someone to help with the day-to-day things. I'm terrible at grocery shopping, remembering to eat actual meals, making sure this place feels like a home instead of a museum." "You're offering me a job?" Maya's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm offering you a chance," James corrected. "Same thing someone offered me once, when I was 19 and sleeping in my car between college classes." The months that followed transformed both of their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. Maya threw herself into her work with a dedication that went far beyond gratitude. She organized James's chaotic personal life, brought warmth to his sterile mansion, and slowly began to heal from the trauma that had driven her to his doorstep. David grew from a frightened infant into a laughing toddler who treated the CEO like a favorite uncle, climbing onto his lap during important phone calls and leaving tiny handprints on his expensive suits. For James, the changes were even more profound. The house that had once been a showpiece became a real home, filled with David's laughter and Maya's quiet strength. He found himself leaving the office earlier, taking weekends off for the first time in his career, discovering the simple joy of teaching a toddler to walk in the garden where he'd once held solitary business dinners. The media, of course, eventually caught wind of the story. Business Weekly ran a feature titled "The CEO's Secret Heart," complete with photos of James pushing David on the swing set he'd had installed in his backyard. Instead of the scandal his board members had feared, the public response was overwhelmingly positive. Morrison Industries saw a surge in both employee applications and customer loyalty, as people connected with a leader who'd proven that success didn't require sacrificing humanity. But the real transformation wasn't captured in any magazine article. It happened in quiet moments, when James would find Maya reading to David by the fireplace where she'd first sought shelter, or when she'd catch him staring out the window with a contentment she'd never seen in those old business magazine photos. They'd both learned that sometimes the most important decisions aren't made in boardrooms or after careful analysis. Sometimes they're made in split seconds, when someone knocks on your door in the middle of a storm and you choose to open it instead of keeping it closed. 2 years after that desperate night, as Maya watched James teach David to ride a bicycle in the garden, she realized that shelter had never really been about having a roof over their heads. True shelter was about finding people who would protect not just your body, but your heart, your dreams, and your capacity to believe in goodness again. And James, watching the woman who'd stumbled into his life transform his house into a home and his success into something meaningful, understood that the most profitable investment he'd ever made hadn't involved stocks or real estate. It had simply required opening his arms when someone needed shelter, and discovering that kindness, unlike capital, only grows when you give it away.